Now, all that drama over the debt ceiling has a direct bearing on our next story. This week, top officials from 9 Asian countries, that is, members of the Asian Clearing Union, the ACU, gathered in Tehran for their annual meeting. And guess what took the center stage of discussion? It was de-dollarization. Now, what exactly does de-dollarization mean? In simple words, it means reducing the US dollar's dominance in global markets. And how exactly is this done? By substituting it as the primary currency for various financial transactions. This includes transactions of trading oil, foreign exchange reserves, and other bilateral trade agreements. Now, let's go back to that annual meeting where officials from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Iran, the Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka gathered. Well, guess who else was present at the meeting? Russia's central bank governor and officials from Belarus and from Afghanistan. Senior political leaders have been suggesting that the dollar's dominance may fade. And with that, one after the other, countries have been dumping dollars. The United Arab Emirates has said it will trade with India in Indian rupees. Egypt had last year announced that it would issue bonds in yuan. Several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Algeria and Bahrain, have said they want to join BRICS. That's, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, and join BRICS in creating a new currency to facilitate overseas trade. And it does not stop there. Russia has already given a green signal that the member countries of BRICS will discuss the creation of a new currency. In fact, Moscow is in broad talks with Islamic nations about de-dollarization. Obviously, Russia's intentions are clear and obvious. China and Russia are already trading in local currencies. For Russia, all of this is following sanctions. The US has imposed sanctions on Russia, and as a result, Russia is desperately looking for alternatives. But going beyond that, Brazil has dumped the dollar to settle trade in yuan with Beijing. Argentina and Brazil have also discussed the creation of a common currency. China, meanwhile, is buying gas from the UAE in yuan. Kenya has shunned the dollars by settling payments in its own currency. India, as you all know, have been settling overseas trade with several countries in the Indian rupee. What may have been as a surprise to Washington is that for the first time in almost 4 decades, Saudi Arabia now, one of the big strategic allies for the US, has started to trade in currencies besides the US dollar. That could mean the end of the petrodollar. And if all of this is not enough, as de-dollarization continues to pick up steam, Iraq has joined China and Brazil to dump the US dollar. The complete ban of use of dollars in Iraq comes within months of the country saying it will do business with China using yuan. Now, let's just step back a bit. Questions around the dominance of the US dollar are nothing new. But this latest row began soon after the Ukraine war, when sanctions were imposed in Russia. The US thought it was punishing Russia, but there was an unintended consequence, as there so often is. Other countries began to worry afresh about the dominance of the dollar. Countries fretted. What would happen if they fell out with Washington? What if they had sanctions imposed on them? And obviously, China was standing by. China took advantage of the situation to push the case of the yuan. Now, events in recent months have obviously added to the pressure on the dollar, especially the rise in inflation and the rise in interest rates and the consequent pressure on many banks. Now, obviously, all of that began with the bust of the Silicon Valley Bank, but after that, many other American financial institutions have also come under strain, also come under crisis. And all of these banks had a single story to tell for their failure, which was directly linked to the interest on the US Treasury bonds. But those treasury bonds and the interest in that are also linked to what the US has been doing for a long time, the printing of currency notes, those debts that are piling up. But now, as the US tries to reverse that, the US Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes have hit the global financial systems. So what exactly has happened here? If you ask me, the real culprit in the debasement of the dollar are the long-term printing of currency by the United States, those debts that are piling up, the foreign exchange debt, all the issues that the US has been having for a long period of time, years if not decades of excess. All of those are chickens that are now coming home to roost. And paradoxically, as the Fed Reserve now says, okay, we're going to try and deal with this, we're going to increase interest rates to try and deal with the present situation, that has its own impact. Global financial markets have been hit globally across the planet as dollars start to flow back into the United States. All of that continues to create stress. So to sum all that up, you seem to have a perfect storm around the dollar. Banks under strain, international efforts to circumvent Western sanctions, the pressures inside the United States as well, the wrangling over the debt crisis, the questions about the long-term debasement of the US dollar by the Americans themselves, and last but not the least, China adding fuel to the de-dollarization fire as it pushes to raise the yuan's global standing. In fact, the dollar's fallen behind the yuan for the first time in Chinese cross-border transactions. China clearly ramping up its efforts to disrupt the dollar trade, and it's leaving no stone unturned. It's entering into non-dollar agreements with as many countries as it possibly can, as of course is Russia. And in the middle of all of this, let's not forget that there is a rise in America's own domestic turbulence because of the debt ceiling crisis and all the other issues that we're talking about. Collectively, this has put the dollar's global standing in a spot. So, is it the end of King Dollar? Not so fast, because there is one crucial question unanswered. If not the dollar, then what? And there's no good answer to that question. Could it be the yuan? Well, hang on. A lot of the world is not going to be happy with that. Could it be a basket of currencies? Yes, but how will that work? Could it be gold? A relic of the past. Can it still happen? Could it be crypto? Well, personally, I say God forbid, but let's see. Are any of these the answer? Or is the answer none of the above? In which case, reports of the demise of the dollar could be somewhat premature. And let's now get in Professor Roberto Barrio to discuss this in some detail. Professor Barrio is Professor of Economics at Harvard University, joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Barrio, just wanted to ask you, this entire move towards de-dollarization that's being spoken about so much, is it a trial balloon? Is it something that's feasible? Or at the end of the day, is there really nothing that can replace the US dollar as a reserve currency, at least at this moment?
I think that's the most likely outcome. Certainly, the Chinese currency is almost impossible now to use as an international money. I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said there was some possibility that China could be moving in that direction, but certainly not now with the way they're really disengaging from the Western world. In general, I think international trade and investment is moving away from China. The U.S., for example, is increasing sources from elsewhere, including India. Vietnam is another prominent place. You see that, for example, with Apple, with iPhone production. It's dramatically moving away from China, and many other countries are doing that. So the main international competitor for the U.S. dollar would still be the euro, which will play some role. But then I don't know what a third alternative would be.
Now, there are two other possibilities that I could think of. One would be something backed by gold, perhaps. The other could be a basket of currencies. I know the IMF did try the SDR a long time back, didn't work too well. But would either of those be feasible options right now?
It's the gold standard for a long time, and with some role for silver. It had some virtues. I've written on that topic, but it also has a lot of underlying volatility. It does provide some kind of very long-term anchor, but it's not a very good one. I wrote a paper once on commodity reserve currency, which is the idea that you just expressed of really a basket of things. The idea there was linking to a basket of commodities, of which gold might be one, rather than just gold. And in principle, that could be more effective. Bob Hall wrote a paper some time back figuring out what was the optimal combination of currencies, commodities, in order to achieve something like price stability. But in practice, I think it's impractical. I think it's not going to happen, and I don't think we're going to move back toward gold.
All right, I'm going down the list of other possible options. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which we sometimes hear spoken about. But to many people looking at it from the outside, they do look a bit like a Ponzi scheme. It's a strong word to use, but perhaps not far from the truth either.
I think Ponzi scheme is exactly accurate. I think it's basically a bubble. And I certainly wouldn't want to hold Bitcoin over the long term. I mean, there is some reason why you might have demand for some kind of currency that could preserve value in the long run. And if you had some good device for limiting the quantity of issue, that could work. And Bitcoin was attractive because it had some features of that. I think the biggest problem with Bitcoin is it doesn't really rule out competitors. And there's all this entry of alternative kinds of cryptocurrency. And I think in the end, that's going to drive the value to zero, essentially. That's what I would predict. But the timing, of course, is unknown.
No, that's a really interesting prediction. You think the eventual value of Bitcoin will be zero?
That's what I think. I mean, it's either something that works in the long run or it doesn't. If it works in the long run, it's because there's demand for something without intrinsic value. Now, of course, that's true for paper currency. And underlying that is the idea that there's some limitation on the quantity that's issued. And when that gets threatened, that tends to generate something like extreme inflation, which means that the value is getting lower and lower. With respect to cryptocurrency, I think zero long-run value is the most reasonable prediction. But, bubbles can last a long time, and it's not really known in advance when they're going to end.
Well, that's a really interesting warning that all those who are investing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency would be well advised to heed. Okay, let me paint one other possible alternative to the US dollar as the single reserve currency, which is a system where countries start to have a lot of bilateral trade using their own currencies. Like India, for example, trading with X country and Y country and using the Indian rupee to settle that. Multiple countries trading with their own currency and not necessarily mediating everything through the US dollar. Do you think that is a possible situation which could happen, a viable situation?
Well, you'd certainly see some role for that, and some kinds of transactions would conveniently have that form. Basically, that's not what's done within a single country. You could have bilateral exchange involving goods for goods within countries. And of course, typically that proves to be very inconvenient, and it proves to be not something that works for the broader dimension of economic activity. So I think that's also true with regard to bilateral trade. The typical thing is that you're going to be better off using a common money like the dollar, which is agreed on. And if you don't do that, it becomes much more confusing and limited.
All right, Professor Barrow, thank you so much for joining us with that entire perspective. And as we were discussing, not clear what the alternative to the US dollar actually is.